Awesome. So we're going to get started. This won't be long, but it's definitely interesting. So, chapter 14, title Sleepwalking into Fascism. Um, and in between of these chapters, because I had already read the book, I've been reading quite a few other things about the whole fascism setup. And once you start um, getting your head wrapped around what the possible setup is, in that literally 200 years ago, with both the Marxism and the fascism concepts. Many of you know, and you've heard me talk on other videos about Adam Weishaupt setting up what eventually turns into a fascist kind of Marxist concept back in 1776, literally, is when he wrote his book. And you realize that these ideas have kind of like been during that first 100 years, been fertilized, if you will, and had started to grow and sink in different places. And you know that they tried to capture the United States a couple of different times with the central bank. So there had always been that effort to recolonize under a fascist umbrella, one world order, because you realize back in the day, they actually thought that the imperialism was going to be the final solution, that they were basically going to own the world. They were so big, too big to fail, um, that they could do whatever they want. They could go wherever they wanted. They could steal whatever resources they wanted. And they may be temporarily set back, but like with the Boer Wars, the first time they lost, they just went back and killed them all. And they did that every time they found resources that they wanted. So, they were very racist. We see that in some of the language that we've talked about in this book, and they viewed entire civilizations like the continent of Africa as inferior. So, you have, these people, these, elitists, I guess is the word that you could use, um, creating this world order, and whether it was Pan Germany or Pan America or Pan Asia, eventually Pan Arabia, with the Arabic nations, that they were going to sectionalize the world. And then those people, like six sections, there's six chairs at the round table in England that was stood up in the late 1800s. Those people are going to sit at the round table. They're going to decide what happens everywhere. And Cecil Rhodes had created the feeding ground. He had like the Club of 300, the Committee of 300. He had all kinds of subsets of this round table, um, created by the Fabian Society through the will of Cecil Rhodes, who's the one that basically created South Africa, um, and many others, Rhodesia. Um, so they literally were planning the New World Order well over 100 years ago. This is not a new concept. I would argue that the WEF is kind of like window dressing. It's like the curtain hanging there. Um, we're discovering that through this um, new world order, that they created both communism and fascism, so that, and I was just reading in another book today, which is it's about international fascism, but even they use that terminology, the third way. And so you create the 2 extremes, just like we're seeing played out in Israel. You've got 2 extremes going on there, and that's to herd everybody into whatever they've decided is the final solution. They've already decided what it is. They're just going to terrorize you into accepting it. And that's what they did in Germany, and so we've already made the argument that in Germany, and I got more data on that now. As early as 1942, when they were setting up these stay-behind units, they had already began a colony, if you wanna call it that, in Argentina. There's a town in Argentina where they moved a lot of the, um, experiments that they were, creating, like at IG Farben, and there's actually a skunk works, that we'll talk about later, a black program that they set up in Czechoslovakia. And many people believe because Patton made a beeline for that, that that's what got him killed. He discovered their skunk works program in Czechoslovakia. So they changed strategies well before the end of World War II. So international fascism is alive today. It is still dominated by what you would have called Nazis, and it was distributed across the world. There was a large chunk of their scientific community that went to Russia, which is how they ended up in their space program so much farther ahead than us. There was a chunk that we know came here, Operation Paperclip. So there was some very significant ones that went to Argentina. There's a program called the Bell, and it had to do with um, fission, um, like 4 steps past nuclear. And people that went down there to inspect it, um, said it was not even possible because it was about 70 years before its time. That's how far advanced they were. So, if there's no way that, all of those people ended up in our NASA, Los Alamos, and they lost the war. No way. So, we've got a lot more digging to do, just kinda setting the stage for that, and, so when people say I think it's a mistake to say that we're dealing with communism. We're not dealing with communism. We're dealing clearly with fascism. And I'm very particular when I use that word because that is the threat. It did not die in World War II. So the author in Sleepwalking into Fascism, chapter 14, begins talking about CIA's programs called the Family Jewels and Operation Mockingbird. She opens up by saying that Churchill, having announced the Cold War before World War II was even over, um, created the next step of the boogeyman. And because if you're gonna have perpetual wars, you always have to have an enemy, and the enemy has to be named. So even though millions of Russians, way more millions than any other, ethnic group, more Russians died during World War II than anybody else, and they immediately become the enemy, and we've talked throughout this book about why, they hate the Russians so bad, um, and it had nothing to do with Jewish pogroms. It had to do with things like them coming to the aid of the United States during the Civil War, um, and guarding our coast against France and Britain because they were gonna intervene on behalf of the South. It has everything to do with many different things. So, Churchill, on behalf and we've already made the argument that Churchill is basically a closet fascist and had people running back and forth between England and Germany as a underground kind of intel conduit. So the declaration of the Cold War being the next war that we were going to fight, basically the author says terror was unleashed on the American people, and McCarthyism was given precedent over people's rights to question and form conclusions on themselves for themselves. To combat the threat of Soviet propaganda entering the United States and seducing Americans, Operation Mockingbird was created. And as we all know, it was a program that was created by the CIA in the early 50s, because in the late 40s is when, excuse me, World War II was over. So the CIA Family Jewels report was compiled in the mid 1970s that exposed Project Mockingbird and also exposed the fact that the CIA had been wiretapping journalists in Washington. So at the time, CIA Director Alan Dulles was in charge of the CIA, and it talked about the media was basically the CIA would write reports and they would give them to credible reporters, and basically the reporters would sign their name to them and submit them to have them published as if they were their own creations. In Katharine Graham, who was the original owner of the Washington Post biography, the Office of Policy Coordination, which is the operational arm of the CIA, created Operation, she's saying this, that they created Operation Mockingbird in response to addressing Soviet propaganda, and included as part of CIA's contingency respected members of the Washington Post, the New York Times, Newsweek, and CBS, among others. So she's admitting that her newspaper participated in Operation Mockingbird. The Family Jewels report was an investigation made by the CIA to investigate the CIA. You just can't make this shit up. Um, it was in response to the Watergate scandal and the CIA's unconstitutional role in the whole affair, because that's where E. Howard Hunt and the plumbers and everybody else was involved. That's been involved in every evil project that we've covered in this book. That guy's name comes up every time. The CIA would include any other actions that they deemed illegal or inappropriate spanning from the 1950s to the 1970s. We are told most of the report was declassified in June of 2007, 30 years later, hoping that people would have lost interest in the CIA and their wrongdoings. There was a redacted report of a 6-page summary of that report released. Quote, the CIA violated its charter for 25 years until revelations of illegal wiretapping, domestic surveillance, assassination plots, and human experimentation, MK Ultra, but some much worse than that, led to official investigations and reforms in the 1970s. And if you buy that, I'll give you a Brooklyn Bridge to go on top of it. They didn't reform because most of the report was never released. Despite this acknowledged violation of their charter for 25 years, which is the entire time it's been around, the details of this information were kept classified for 30 years, and not just from the public, but from government. In December 1974, the New York Times published an article by Seymour Hersh exposing illegal operations conducted by the CIA dubbed the Family Jewels. This included covert action programs involving assassination attempts on foreign leaders and covert attempts to subvert foreign governments, overthrow the government. They did a lot of coups, a lot. And they were reported for the first time in this article, which is crazy since it's in the New York Times. It discussed efforts by intel agencies to collect information on political activities of U.S. citizens. Hirsch's findings caused the creation of the Church Committee, which was approved in 1975. The Church Committee's final report was published in April 1976, including 7 volumes of Church Committee hearings in the Senate. The Church Committee also published an interim report titled, quote, Alleged Assassination Plots Involving Foreign Leaders. unquote. So among those were what the president of Congo, Dominican Republic, Vietnam, Chile, Cuba, but there's so many more. Paraguay, Uruguay, Brazil, so many more. Um, Italy, Iran, Turkey. We've found so many. So President Ford attempted to withhold the report from the public, but failed and reluctantly issued Executive Order 11905 after pressure from the public and the church committee. Executive Order 1105 is a U.S. presidential executive order dated February 18th, 1976, by a very reluctant President Ford in an attempt to reform the U.S. intelligence community, improve oversight on foreign intel activities, and ban political assassination. Well, guess what? It didn't work. But get this, the next time somebody tells you that President Reagan is a good guy, write this down. All of that was undone by President Reagan's Executive Order 12333, which extended the powers and responsibility of U.S. intelligence agencies and directed leaders of the U.S. federal agencies to cooperate fully with the CIA, which was the original arrangement. The CIA had full authority over clandestine operations. And because of this executive order, everybody else had to go along with it, even if it was wrong. Is that crazy? Yeah. We've exposed President Reagan in many other ways. Um, the Hidden Histories over on my Substack does a good job of that as well. He just isn't the person that we thought he was. And believe me, that's like a stab in my heart. That was my very first vote was for President Reagan. The church committee produced 7 case studies on covert operations, but we only ever got to see one on Chile. They kept the rest classified. One of the most shocking discoveries was Operation Shamrock, which I put the link in the chat for. This is when major telecommunications. See, we think that the NSA is just something that recently came along and they just recently started spying on us. Like, the Hayden, and they're like, oh my God, he lied. Honey, they've been doing this forever. So, major telecommunication companies shared their traffic with NSA from 1945 until the early 1970s. And why put a date on it? Because we know they're still doing it. The information gathered was fed into an NSA watch list, just like now. It was found out during the investigation that Senator Frank Church, who was overseeing the committee, was on the watch list. A sitting senator was on the watch list. They were spying on him, and they still exist today. That tells you every single one of our politicians is crap. The church committee decided to unilaterally declassify the particulars of this operation, this particular one, Shamrock, over the objections of President Ford. Let that sink in. Eventually, another 50,000 pages were declassed under the JFK Assassination Records Collection Act of 1992. So there exists an official recognition that false news was not only being encouraged by the CIA during the Cold War, but the CIA was actually directing it. Then the author says, did the Cold War ever end? Not according to the CIA, it didn't. They just changed. They picked a new enemy called Muslim terrorists. So there's a guy by the name of Udo, Udo, Yul, um, Ulfkotte, Lof Lofgate. He is a well-known German he was, because yeah, he got suicided too. Um, a well-known German journalist who had written numerous books. He worked for 25 years as a journalist. 17 of them was from for an organization, FAZ, in Frankfurt, and he was an editor. In 2014, he wrote a book called Journalists for Hire: How the CIA Buys News. I'm just going to call him Udo. Udo. Um, he goes over how the CIA, along with the German intelligence, BND, and keep in mind, BND was set up by the Galen, the chief of the Nazi intel. So they're the exact equivalent of the CIA, founded by Nazis, and I would argue our CIA was too, fascist anyway. Um, were bribing journalists to write articles that had a pro-NATO bent, which of course we know why that is too, because NATO is where they were housing Operation Gladio. So in an interview, he said that he finally got up enough nerve to publish the book years after he had already written it because he was afraid of the backlash. So he finally published it in 2014 when the crisis in Ukraine of the overthrow of their government was occurring and the Gladio operation of mowing down the 100 people in the center square. He had had enough. That was the end of it for him. And listening to the reports coming out of that when he knew everything was a lie, he just couldn't do it anymore. So he said, I felt it was the right time to do it. And he says, but it is clear that many journalists blindly follow and publish whatever NATO press office provides. And this type of information and reports are completely one sided. So he's watching during the 2014 revolution in Ukraine, the NATO press coming out with blatant lies that he knows are lies, that he has reporters as an editor that are being bribed to write what NATO is telling them to write, and he finally says no more. He gets his book off the shelf and he publishes it. So he does it. There's a couple excerpts in the book about things that he says, one of which is, I am ashamed of it, asking, this is a public statement that he made, quote, I am ashamed of it. The people I worked for knew from the get-go everything I did, and the truth must come out. It's not just about FAZ. It is the whole system that's corrupt all the way, unquote. So he died in January of 2017. He had a heart attack at home at 56. He was immediately cremated, no autopsy. The name of his book is Prostitutes, Embedded in the Pay of the CIA, a confession from the profession. That's a catchy title. And unfortunately, as we've seen in so many of these books that we've done, the brave people in the press that do report the truth oftentimes ends up dead. I'm not saying that like jokingly. It's actually pathetic. Um, but thank God there are some people that are brave enough to do it. So today's situation concerning the media reporting on Ukraine does not seem to be any different from the manipulated spin controlled by intelligence agents that this guy was exposing. If anything, it's actually worse. Well, I'd say it's worse because now they're using clips of video games and trying to sell it as real fighter scenes. Kiev has churned out a steady stream of sophisticated propaganda. And the author does a really good job of going into some of that. Ukraine's propaganda strategy earned praise from NATO commander who told the Washington Post they, Ukraine, are really excellent in Stratcom, which is strategic communications, media info ops, and also psyops, unquote. That's what they're doing. They're doing psyops, effective stratcon from the military guy. Dan Cohen of Mint Press News writes, quote, key to the propaganda effort is an international legion of public relation firms working directly with Ukraine Ministry of Foreign Affairs to wage information warfare. According to the industry news site PR Week, the initiative was launched by an anonymous figure who allegedly founded a Ukraine-based public relation firm. I'd bet that's CIA. According to the anonymous figure, more than 150 public relation firms have joined the propaganda blitz. Think about that for just a second. It's not enough to have one or two to feed and seed articles. 150, that's a lot of money because they're all paid. That's a lot of money to pay 150 PR firms for propaganda, which tells me the whole thing was propaganda. 5G warfare. The international effort is spearheaded by public relations firm PR Network co-founder Nikki Regazzoni and Francis Ingram. Now, I would highly recommend y'all look them up. Let me spell Nikki's last name. Regazzoni, and Francis Ingram, Ingham. Because let me tell you where the rabbit hole will take you, just real quick. These people rep evil people. One of the rabbit holes I went down in researching this group, their firm represented an Indian family who basically has bought the South African government, the prior government. And these people were their PR arm. They worked diligently in South America to rationalize the rape, pillage, and plunder of a country of all of its natural resources. And these people were taking billions of dollars and flying them out to Dubai to defraud the government in South America or South Africa. And they had bought the president. He was helping them. The international effort to spearhead the PR firm. Oh, we already got that. Never mind. Ingram previously worked for Britain's Conservative Party, sits on the UK Government Communications Services Strategy and Evaluation Council, and is chief executive of the International Communications Consultancy Organization, and leads the membership body for the UK Local Government Communications, LG Comms. Now, keep in mind, Britain is the seat of fascism. So this chick is right at the side table in the PR information warfare department. Ingram, who has been a member of the UK government and continues to have high level connections within the British government, has played a leading role in shaping the Ukraine war. But we all saw through it. So she's not that dang good. PR firms have the responsibility for reporting and spreading fabricated news, and even when such reports have found to be conclusively not true, they continue to use them. These PR tools include propaganda graphics. They encourage radicalization, promotion of ultranational identities. They use xenophobic and racist language, outright praise of Ukrainian neo-Nazis, in this case, as heroes, and idolization of the Nazi leader Stefan Bandera, which we know was part of the whole Operation Gladio back during World War II in setting up stay-behind units in Ukraine. So then the author goes and talks about the fact checkers in the case of a group called Stop Fake, who was self-described themselves as like a fact checker. They are funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a CIA front, um, and they're affiliated with the Atlantic Council. The International Renaissance Foundation, which is funded by Open Society George Soros, the British Embassy in Ukraine, the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and the German Marshall Fund. Stop Fake was hired by Facebook, because of course it was, March 2020 to curb the flow of Russian propaganda um, going into our elections. So at the end of the day, it does not seem to matter how many of these arbiters of truth are found to be wrong. They just keep lying to the public, especially on the Ukraine subject. So, fact checking the fact checkers in Ukraine, she says specifically, interestingly, the Atlantic Council itself acknowledges that the neo Nazi problem in Ukraine was quite serious, but they did that in 2018. Then it was allowed to be said. Once the war started or the special military operation, you are no longer allowed to say that. Just that's how ridiculous this is. Josh Cohen writes, quote, "It sounds like the stuff of Kremlin propaganda, but it's not. Last week, a radio station revealed that Ukraine's Ministry of Youth and Sports, which is another basically terrorist organization, is funding the neo-Nazi group C14 to promote national patriotic education projects in the country." This Ukraine Ministry of Youth and Sports came up when I was looking at Gladio stay behind units. It is definitely that. And Turkey did the same thing. Turkey had one that was considered the Ministry of Youth that was basically hiding their younger training camps, like late teens, to make people into Gladio operators. So the author goes on, yes, you read that right. C14, along with the Azov Battalion, have been training children with encouragement and funding by the Ukrainian government via the Ukraine Ministry of Youth and Sports under the title, quote, National Patriotic Education Projects, using exercises in terror tactics. So those people that are on social media that likes to send you those clips of these little kids that are supposedly, and I don't know whether they are or not, not saying it derogatorily, from Hamas training camps, they're doing this in Ukraine, and they're doing this in Ukraine with our tax dollars. So I I just get livid every time this they show me these pictures because I can show them picture after article of our CIA supporting this very thing. So you only want to look at they only want to look at the surface. Josh Cohen continues, quote, since the beginning of 2018, C14 and other not far right, fascist, far left groups, such as the Azov affiliated National Militia, Right Sector, Karpatska Sikh, and others have attacked group several times, as well as anti fascist demonstrations, city council meetings, and events hosted by Amnesty International, LGBT events, and environmental activists. On March 8th, violent groups launched attacks against International Women's Day marchers in cities across Ukraine. In only a few of these cases did police do anything to prevent the attacks. And that's a key figure on a key indicator, if you will, on how you know it's Gladio affiliated. Because much of the police are in, as we saw in Italy, as we saw in Portugal, as we saw in Greece, much of the police force, either the Masonic affiliations or whatever, are in on the whole Gladio operation, and they stand down. They don't do anything. and they know in advance that it's going to happen. In this case, some of the cops arrested the International Women's Day marchers as opposed to the people that were attacking them. Sounds like January 6th. Another I'm telling you, it has the hallmarks of Gladio everywhere. After March 8th, 2018 attacks against the Women's Day marchers, Cohen said that Amnesty International wrote, quote, Ukraine is sinking into a chaos of uncontrolled violence posed by radical groups and their total impunity. Practically no one in the country can feel safe under these conditions, unquote. And that, my friend, is what they want. Because you see the exact same, we talked about the Mafi, the Jerusalem Mafi, and his attacks of setting up both Jewish and Arabic people in Israel prior to Israel being a country. And he was being paid by the British authorities at the time. He set the scenario up so both of those people ruthlessly killed each other by faking pictures, by they had this big radio broadcast and he would broadcast, "Oh, the Jewish just burned down a mosque." Well, then they would have instigators and they would have people going door to door to get people out. "Oh, they just burned a mosque. We got to go attack the Jewish people." And then the opposite would happen. They would go and tell the Jewish people that the Arabs had just burnt down some building of theirs and get them all riled up to go attack the Arabs. And they instigated all of it. And at the very end, there was so much terror going on that the people wanted safety. And where did they go to get safety? The government. That's what's going on in Ukraine. That's what all of this is about. So Josh Cohen goes on and writes, quote, to be clear, far right but left parties like Svoboda perform poorly in Ukraine's polls and elections, and Ukrainians have no desire to be ruled by them, but this argument is a bit of a red herring. It is not extremist electoral prospects that should concern Ukraine's friends, but rather the state's unwillingness or inability to confront the violent groups and end their impunity. But they don't want to. They're allowed to do that on purpose because the leaders has been paid off. They want a fascist government, and we just saw that he canceled the elections. They have a fascist government. That's what they want. That's the end state for everybody. So one of the leaders of the C14 group um, says that the true determinants of power politics in Ukraine have never been about the polls and elections. So the author talks about, mentions Victoria Nuland and then U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, revealed to a dumbfounded world the Ukrainian people don't actually have a say in who runs their government. This is in 2014 because, we cooed their government. After the so-called revolution of dignity, so uh, their word choices are exactly the opposite every time. Where Ukrainians literally died for democracy, the U.S. went on to influence the roster of the newly formed Ukrainian government, specifically around members of the neo-Nazi group So- Svoboda and right sector, who held 5 senior roles in the new government, including the post of the deputy prime minister. And I did on my Substack, I did write an article a long time ago about right sector. Um, a lot of it was based on my friend's information that was a Ukraine intel trainer for a long time. Spent a lot of years over in Ukraine. Um, and they all knew about Reich Sector and the Azov and the Nazi infiltration over there. that our government tried to pretend didn't even exist. So in October 2021, as a reaction to the failed diplomatic visit to Russia, Victoria Nuland, according to French journalist, went ahead and imposed a guy by the name of Yarosh, Yarosh, onto President Zelensky. President Zelensky appointed Yarosh, who is the leader of Right Sector, which is a Nazi group, a fascist Nazi group, as advisor to the commander in chief of the armed forces of Ukraine. Nuland is of Ukrainian Jewish descent. Thus, her ongoing support for the Nazis in Ukraine government and the military since 2014 is disturbing on multiple levels. But it makes sense if you read the article I just recently wrote on the Zionist element within the Jewish religion, which is not a traditional Jewish religion that you and I think about. Um, the Zionist movement was created by the very same people that we've discussed at nauseum at the Round Table, the Fabian Society, the London School of Economics. Those are the same people that basically created the Zionist movement. It is not. I didn't know that. I thought that I'd heard about it for my whole lifetime. I thought it'd been around forever. It has not. It's another made up thing, like the made up states, made up kings. They make a lot of shit up, and none of it's good. If you haven't noticed, um, Right Sector has close connections with Trident and Patriot of Ukraine, which are more um, ultra fascist groups, all militarized, like stay behind units. Um, and some of them are even on the Interpol's most wanted list. But this one guy, the Yarosh guy, was he had been on the wanted list since 2014, though he was taken off the international wanted list of Interpol in 2016. He remained on the wanted list section of Interpol's website, but Interpol refused to tell the Kiev Post as to why he had been removed. Well, he was been removed because the US and the intel agencies and Victoria Nuland was going to use him for something. Westerners are told the right sector is merely a nationalist party defending freedom of the Ukrainian people, which is a bold-faced lie. They are fascist, and they look to the Stepan Bandera as their hero from World War II. And just in case y'all don't remember, he's the guy that was responsible for the mass murder. Him and they had I forget they had the dash M and the dash B, and him and the dash M guy, they had basically segregated the nationalist movements out of a disagreement. And the guy whose last name started with an M and Bandera are the ones that were um, vying for Hitler's approval on who could murder the most people, primarily Jewish people, but they're fellow countrymen too. Um, and basically, um, their level of depravity knew no bounds, in the torture area. I won't get that gross, but it's really gross. So neo-Nazis have received ongoing training from the CIA, the British SAS, which tells you those are another Gladio telltale signs because that's who trains Gladio units, as well as NATO countries such as Canada, because remember Canada has training sites, as does the US, as does Portugal. So you got a lot of neo-Nazis training in Canada, according to the author. On the same day, um, so there's a as the same day, NATO tweets on International Women's Day of a Ukrainian soldier who happens to be wearing the Nazi black sun occult symbol. there's everybody immediately notices this too. So they're showing training from NATO countries on grenade launchers, and this is on the Canada, uh, saying that Canada is training these people on grenade launchers and all this other stuff. I guess they didn't realize that they had captured this patch, which specifically identified it was an Azov battalion, and this was before the Azov battalions. Let's see when this was. Um, it's 2022 in March, and I'm not sure that they had actually been folded into their military at that time. They were considered a National Guard, if you will, unit. It doesn't matter. The fact is that everybody knows there's Nazis, and the fact that they had posted training of them on rocket launchers and they're Nazis is just beyond the pale. There's a whole bunch of other pictures that were tweeted out, of the training with the, Azov banners in the right sector patches. So the author goes on to say that, a little bit more about the Azov battalions, the first commander, that led the paramilitary organization called Patriot of Ukraine. Uh, and they say in 2010 that Ukrainian nation's mission is, quote, lead the white races of the world in a final crusade against Semite led subhumans, unquote. That's the Azov battalion. Those are the ones that Canada and NATO are training and that the CIA classifies as basically stay behind units. Fascist in every definition of the word. In 2019, a Sufan Center, which tracks terrorist and extremist groups around the world, warned, quote, the Azov battalion is emerging as a critical node in the transnational right wing, but it's a left wing violent extremist network. Its aggressive approach to networking serves one of the Azov battalion's overarching objectives to transform areas under its control in Ukraine into a primary hub for transnational white supremacy. Unquote. There's no one that doesn't know that Azov Battalion is a fascist organization in every sense of the word. In 2014, Newsweek published an article titled, quote, Ukrainian nationalist volunteers committing ISIS-style war crimes, unquote. This is an indication of both Azov and ISIS getting their so they're in the military when you get training on how to do certain things and it becomes forensic evidence when you see like, just take beheadings or the, 1 to 2 shots, point blank in the back of your head. So that's a mafia hit. The beheadings are known by certain groups, that that's their method of terror. So it's forensically significant based on the crimes they're committing and how they're doing it. Keep in mind that the trainings were done, like, on the island of Sardinia, off the coast of Italy, um, off the coast of Portugal and Canada, Fort Bragg, Fort Benning, and a Navy base in the Southern California that we know about. Those are all identified, um, Gladio training sites. And so anybody that are trained at those different ones will be trained in particular techniques to use and they're a forensic signature on who's committing the atrocities. And that's what the author is trying to say that it the style of executions of the ethnic Russians that Azov and Right Sector were slaughtering in the Donbass region prior to the special military operation that they were terrorizing had forensic signatures on it that looked just like ISIS. And we know that we are the ones, the CIA, that created ISIS. And we also have the fact that Canada is doing the training for the Azov um, fascists in Ukraine. So they have forensic signatures on how they commit the terror. NATO has recently gone so far as to make a short film honoring the Baltic Nazi collaborators, the Forest Brothers. The NATO film lionizes the Forest Brothers, former Waffen SS fighters who voluntarily collaborated with the Nazis as anti communist heroes. And keep in mind, Forest Brothers is Gladio, because where did Gladio put all of their, weapon stashes? In the forest. That's where they buried their weapons, their communication equipment, their money, and their explosives. So, NATO is glorifying their own creation of the Gladio units. Quote, "By going beyond turning a blind eye to the worship of pro-Hitler forces in Eastern Europe, NATO is crossing the line right into offering its moral legitimization of Nazi forces such as the Latvian Waffen SS." Unquote. So David Ignatius of the Washington Post, who obviously we know is tied into the CIA because he was the one that was involved in the whole takedown of Trump, um, says that even prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, quote, "The US and NATO allies were ready to provide weapons and training for the long battle resistance." Unquote. Yes. He also wrote, quote, "The great democratic, revelation that has swept the globe over the past few years has been a triumph of overt action. The CIA old boys spent a generation fantasizing about this sort of global anti-communist takeover. But when it finally happened, it was in the open. Working in broad daylight, the US and its allies were able to do things that would have been unthinkably dangerous had they been done in the shadows." So basically, what he is telling you right there is the CIA's mission was their code word for fascist is anti communist. Nothing about Gladio or this war, to implement one world order is anti-communist. It has nothing to do with that. They're in bed with the communists whenever they wanna be. We know that during World War in the lead up to World War II, that German had built weapons factories in Russia to resupply their own weapons and basically paid to create those, industries in Russia. It's never been about, anti-communist because they all funded the same communists the same way they did the fascists. That's an excuse. That's the yin and yang. I've gotta have communism so I can shove fascism down your throat. And I only created Nazism to make it appear way over here and the communists way over here so I can do the nice thing and shove fascism down your throat. It's all garbage. So, he goes on and writes, "The covert action boys have were known back then as the Office of Policy Coordination. It may be time at last to bid them adieu. They're obsolete. They've been privatized. That's especially true in the realm of what used to be called propaganda and can now simply be called information." That's just so sick. Frank Wisner, the head of the CIA covert operations during the mid 1950s, once remarked that he could play the media assets like a mighty Wurlitzer. Today, the mighty Wurlitzer actually exists. It's called CNN. Alan Weinstein is probably the dean of the new overt operatives, like many of the people running the new nations of Eastern Europe. He's an ex professor and even worked for several months writing editorials for the Washington Post. Now, with the KGB in retreat from Prague, recall the Soviet Union was dissolved on December 26, 1991. Weinstein has scheduled a conference in Sofia, Bulgaria on the topic, the proper role of intelligence agencies in a democracy. Yeah, there are none, as far as I'm concerned. And she quotes quite a bit more of what he's saying. I'm just going to quote a few more. Um, he says the AFL-CIO deserves a healthy pat on the back for basically allowing this to happen. A lot of what we do today was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA. Weinstein agrees. The biggest difference is that when such activities are done overtly, the flat potential is close to zero. Openness is its own protection. These people are sick. The sugar daddy of overt operations has been the National Endowment for Democracy, the quasi private group headed by Carl Gushman and Weinstein that is funded by the US Congress. Through the late 1980s, it did openly what had once been done unspeakably covert. That needs to scare the hell out of you. Covert funding for these groups would have been the kiss of death if discovered. Overt funding, so what they're basically telling you is they set these organizations up, they get them funded through the government, and then they use them to kill our public. That's all they're saying right here, over and over again. Alan Weinstein, former Trotskyite, is the founder of the National Endowment for Democracy, along with Carl Gershman. Notice how Ignatius mentioned their infiltration into the trade unions. I guess the National Endowment for Democracy has recently had a change of heart on openness and its own protection. Jeremy Kuzmarov for Covert Action magazine writes in an article titled "The National Endowment for Democracy Deletes Records of Funding Projects in Ukraine." So much for openness. The National Endowment for Democracy, quote, a CIA offshoot founded in the early 1980s to advance democracy promotion initiatives around the world, has deleted all records of funding projects in Ukraine from its searchable award grant search database, unquote. The archived web page captured February 25th, 2022 shows that National Endowment for Democracy, granted $22 million in the form of 334 awards to Ukraine between 2014 and present. That's that's a lot of money. And because they're in the contracts database, that means we paid for that through the CIA, by the way. The capture at later that same day shows no results for Ukraine. As of right now, there are still no results for Ukraine. The erasure of these records is necessary to validate the Biden administration's big lie echoed in the media that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was unprovoked. We spent $22 million provoking them. We built bioweapons labs provoking them. We funded a coup, two of them actually, provoking them. But yeah, nothing to see here. Move on. Who suffers at the end? The Ukrainian people. As Lindsey Graham recently stated upon his celebratory role in passing legislation to send billions of dollars in lethal aid to Ukraine, quote, I like the structural path we are on here. As long as we help Ukraine with the weapons it needs and economic support, they will fight to the last person, unquote. Just not him. So Putin's reason for going into Ukraine was to not denazify the country. Now you understand? I just showed you where all of the Nazis are, what they're doing, and they've been there since 1940s. They never left. They just got more vicious and more brutal. And we were training them. I personally know military people, my friends that were in Ukraine training them. I don't think they knew well, I don't not I think. They did not know ultimately what they were gonna do with that training. They had no idea, and I know that for a fact. Um, you can understand how Ukraine's entry into NATO was unacceptable for Russian leadership, although I'll tell you with all their Nazis, they'd fit right into NATO. However, when one considers that NATO is also involved in the promotion of neo-Nazi militants in Ukraine, and that now, at the time of this writing, both Sweden and Finland have also expressed a desire to join NATO with no referendum since democracy is officially dead in Cold War 2.0, we can see a perfect storm beginning to take shape. However, this is not just a threat to Russia. The reality of the situation is that Ukraine has been in a civil war for the past 8 years. And that presents the whole, because supposedly up until the Balkans, NATO wasn't supposed to go to war unless a NATO country was attacked. But we saw that fly right out the window almost immediately. Another quote from Mint Press News: people who take at face value the Western media's coverage should have a very distorted perception of the conflict in Ukraine. They omit and deny that there is a civil war in Donbass, even though the majority of the scholars who have published or presented concerning this conflict in Western academic venues classify it as a civil war with Russian military intervention. The Western media also admits that recent unity marches in Kiev and a staged training of civilians were organized and led by the far right left neo Nazi Azov battalion. So there's another quote from another news guy. In other words, the neo-Nazi militia that surged to the front of the anti-Yakunovich protests have now been organized as shock troops dispatched to kill ethnic Russians in the east part of Ukraine. Yes, that's right. So they're Gladio units. They use them however they want. So the author has a map that's basically of the current Ukraine that shows for those, and I know all of y'all know this, but you have the far east of the Ukraine that had the primarily Donbass region, but the Lugansk, the Kherson, all of those regions on the eastern part of the country voted to rejoin Russia because they're basically all ethnic Russians. And the US NATO support for the neo Nazis in Ukraine got so bad that in 2018, Congress had to ban the United States from sending further arms to Ukraine militia linked to the Nazi units, specifically mentioning the Azov battalion. For some reason, this ban was only to last for 3 years. So, what's interesting is think about this where we went. So from 1940-ish, mid 40s to the 90s, all of the fascist Nazi stay behind units, the terror units, all in complete um, anonymity. They have to be hidden. They have to be funded with black money. It can't be overt money. Um, And look at where we're at today. Like that one author said, it's all out in the open now. We are actively, overtly propagandizing, supporting Nazis. And you have to think strategically, that's probably the whole reason this is happening, right? Where else are you going to find? Well, I don't even want to know the answer to that question, but I'm going to say it. So we know there's a large contingent of Nazis in Ukraine. Okay. So if I wanted to move my agenda forward, And I wanted to move from funding them with drug, um, uh, black world, weapons trafficking. If I wanted to move that all out into the light, what better place to do it, right? So I have the Nazis. I've already identified the Nazis are there. And now I've got the United States government and all of the NATO countries funding out in the open Nazis. Look how far we've came. And we're doing it overtly, just like that Office of Democracy, whatever garbage said. They've literally transformed and went from a shadow organization that had to be funded with drug profits to using our tax dollars to pay for Nazis, and we're not doing a damn thing about it. It's just crazy. Absolutely crazy. Okay, so, but you may say, what about Russia's crimes against Ukrainian people? Aren't they far worse or even vicious? Namely, the bombing of Mariupol Theater and the Bucha massacre that happened on March 31st, 2022. Thorough journalistic investigations have already been done on the former case, which conclusively demonstrated it was the Mariupol one was a false flag. As far as the Bucha massacre, there have been no evidence presented conclusively proves who committed the atrocity. There have only been assertions repeated and recycled which fall far short of anything being called evidence. Recall the chemical attacks in Syria were also supported by repeated assertions that the Assad government was to blame. In 2013, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh wrote a report titled Who's Sarin? Meaning sarin gas, which conclusively proved that the popular assertion being pushed by the Obama government in their attempt to incriminate the Syrian government was in fact false. Rather, Hirsch's investigation pointed to the fact that the actual terrorists had used sarin on Syrian civilians were those same rebels receiving Anglo American funding and arms. So, in other words, like a Gladio, false flag. Unfortunately, time is of the essence in investigating crimes such as these, and despite the outcries of inhumanity of the events, there is always heavy foot dragging, if not outright dismissal, of any attempt to establish the official or neutral investigations. Why is this? Russia had asked the UN Security Council for an immediate investigation of the Bucha massacre. China had also called for an official investigation into this and received backlash for withholding blame until all facts were known, because, you're not allowed to do that. Nobody wants to know the truth. You just have to put blame wherever NATO tells you to put blame and shut up. Why has an official investigation been repeatedly refused? This should be the official protocol for such matters. Instead, the response to this was for the United Nations to suspend Russia from its human rights body. You're not allowed to ask questions. Shut up. The disturbing elephant in the room in all of this is the Azov battalion had already been found guilty of similar atrocities against its own Ukrainian people, which has been thoroughly investigated by Max Blumenthal and Ishra Goswami in their paper, One Less Traitor. Zelensky oversees campaign of assassination, kidnapping, and torture of political opponents. The Azov battalion has also been found guilty of putting Ukrainian citizens in jeopardy by positioning their artillery and military in residential buildings, including daycares and hospitals. Even the Washington Post acknowledged their misleadingly titled article, Russia has killed civilians in Ukraine. Kiev's defensive tactics add to the danger. You see how that works? However, there are not simply defense tactics. They were blatant war crimes, which is true. They are. Just to be clear here, during times of war, to which the Washington Post also acknowledges, Ukrainian soldiers and weaponry are legitimate targets for Russian military. It is not Russia that is committing the war crime. It's Ukraine by putting their military equipment in daycares. But they know that. In November 2015, a UN resolution was brought forward by Russia condemning the glorification of Nazism. Of the total 126 member states, 53 countries, including members nations of the European Union, abstained from voting. 4 countries voted against the resolution. Okay, wait a minute. I want to read this for you again. Russia brought forth a UN resolution condemning Nazism. Who voted against it? Canada, the United States, Ukraine, and Palau, Palau. We voted against condemning Nazism. And 53 countries, including member nations of the European Union, abstained. Well, they created it, so they can't vote against it. But we voted against it. That's just freaking crazy. In fact, since 2014 up to the current year, which is 2022 for this book, the US and Ukraine have voted with a resounding no to the UN resolution, which is brought up every year. Wonder why that is. And that's interesting because that includes during Trump's administration. Why would we vote no? On January 2022, hundreds of Ukrainian nationalists held a torchlight march in the capital of Kiev to mark the birthday of Stepan Bandera, one of the leaders of the there it is, the OUN. That's the name of that neo-Nazi. Well, it was Nazi at the time. There was a organization of Ukrainian nationalists, OUN, and then there was a dash M for the one guy and a dash B during World War II for the Bandera patriot Nazis. And it's paramilitary Ukrainian insurgent army who fought alongside the Nazis in World War II. So, we're just going to celebrate the Nazis here. The Ukrainian nationalists were observed holding the blood and soil flag in their torchlight march, just like we were back in um, World War II. So, at the end of the book here, the author very appropriately has the uh, um, speech from JFK called "A City Upon a Hill," and he read this as he was leaving Massachusetts, going to the presidency. And when you read this in light of what we all now know, um, it's very, very uh, encouraging. He talks about having people of, he says men, but people of courage, people of judgment, people of integrity, and people of dedication. And that those 4 historic qualities is basically what you need as patriots to get to carry on. And I would highly encourage anybody to read those. Also, in here, there's an appendix about the origins of the Milner Rhodes Roundtable movement, which we covered a lot at the very beginning. If you missed that, I would definitely suggest you go back and read that. What you need to know about that is the fact that I would argue, when people always ask who's at the top, who's in control, um, I would argue to a large extent and this isn't like, to me, the very top, because I do believe there is a royal, like a bloodline issue here. Um, but the administrative state of the New World Order definitely goes back 100% to the Round Table, and the Cecil Road. So I would definitely encourage people to look into that. We are the next podcast, I'll tell you that. I will, do the schedule for this coming week because basically we're gonna do probably 4 podcasts, 2 on one book and 2 on the other book, just to kinda this is one of the books here. I don't encourage you to read this or buy it. This is, another Gladio book, and this book, like, Daniel, Gansler's book, goes through the scenarios, um, by event, the terror events, that make up Operation Gladio, the ones that are most well known. Okay, so I'm going to take a few of the most well-known ones that you guys will recognize and kinda give you the Reader's Digest version of them. I'm gonna do 2 podcasts on each book, and then we're going to, um, as the plan goes now, we are going to jump into, Whitney Webb's, um, blackmail books. This is actually one book broken into 2 volumes. It's very big. I've already read it. Um, and not that our minds can be blown, but I think you will see how her book dovetails into everything we've just learned. And what I want to do is to give y'all the feeling that not the feeling, that's not the right word. I wanted to give you the tools that creates the foundation that when you look at stuff, you can evaluate it in a rational, intelligent way and not an emotional way. That's how we break the matrix. If our first response is emotional, which is what they want, we've lost. If we have enough knowledge to be able to look at things analytically without the emotion and call it for what it is and ask intelligent questions and not believe what we're seeing. Y'all can see by the comments that we get, there's still people that are on that treadmill. And I've got to thank every one of you. We primarily do it in a very respectful way. We had a guy today that came in, never seen him before. He doesn't follow me, um, and said something, but several of y'all um, let him know that he was wrong. And you did it in a very articulate, nice way, but very assertive because you now know what you're talking about. And I could not be more proud of people. Um, and I think that's how we do it. I think there more and more people are going to be coming to us because y'all are going to other people's pages and go, hey, we know about this. Come over here. And you're directing them over to us. And when they come, we can give them the facts and we can then send them out. And I'm telling you, y'all know I spend a lot of hours doing this. And it's all worth it for 5 minutes of watching y'all do that. Cool Beans did it today, 5 minutes. I was ecstatic. I get this. It's literally like your kid taking its first steps. I know that sounds awful, but it is. That's how exciting it is for me. Because and I feel like I'm a broken record every time somebody says something or a new subject will come up and you're going like, why can't y'all just say Gladio? You did everything except for say Gladio because whatever the event was, um, somebody was talking about, the background of 9/11 or whatever it was. It's Gladio. Everything's not, I realize that, but it does explain a lot, and, I'm just glad we are where we are, and, so we'll have 4 podcasts this week. I'll get the schedule out. Thursday, we will have another podcast. I don't know whether it'll be live or recorded with War Hamster. We are going that's why I didn't spend the time to do it tonight on her little section of the round table background. He and I are going to do a deep dive into that. I find it fascinating. You may find it boring. I completely understand. But if there was a what do you call that? A Rosetta Stone of this whole chapter, I honestly think it's the Round Table. I think it's the Fabian Society. If you understand the way they think, um, where that thought process comes from, the um, the mystic, esoteric Gnosticism that is involved in it, um, it is truly frightening and at the same time very, very important to understand because when people say it's biblical, it's totally biblical. Um, I'm not a Bible scholar. I don't profess to be. This is foundational satanic forces against Christianity. And when you go back and you look at the root of that stone that created this nastiness, um, It it again, it adds to the foundation. So when somebody comes at you with information that's dead wrong, you can point them in the right direction. And you know the difference between um, people who are just misguided and people who have grasped a hold of this and are truly on the side of evil when you understand it. So, having said that, let me look at some of the comments. Um, Eugenics, purification. Oh, you're so right. The dirty seed, yes. Um, okay. Russia doesn't sound so I'm telling you, Bridget, I, I'm not I'm not going to be the one that tells you that I'm not passing judgment on Russia. I am telling you that we have 1000% been lied to about just about everything. Um, let's see what else we got. Okay, it's crazy how the media has told us to write about us in Ukraine and then switch to say they don't exist. You're right, Julie. Yep. Um, CIA scrubbing files. Well, and that's interesting because you know that the there's a large amount of people that believe that the entire Wikipedia is a CIA op, and of course, it becomes completely. But when people first say things like that to me, my first reaction is what? Um, but again, patterns, okay? So, when you had Google set up and everybody in their department that's supposed to be um, the information quality people are both from the CIA and FBI, you start going, hmm. And then you look on, LinkedIn and you search on that office name, it's escaping me off the top of my head right now, what it's called. Let's just call it quality assurance. Um, the, uh and you look at it for the old Twitter, those people all had CIA backgrounds, and then you're like, "Well, son of a gun, uh, maybe there's something to this." And then, what's the other one? Um, it's not Google, so Facebook, same thing. They had, like, a ton of in just that one office. That's the only office I looked at. Um, there was a ton of people in that office that was from the CIA and FBI, and you're like, "Okay, alright, I'll buy the Wikipedia thing now." Because again, it's patterns, and once we know what to look for, we can recognize the patterns, and, that's what we're here for. So, that's what I've got, unless anybody has any questions, um, I do think, and I'm not saying obviously I use Wikipedia as a initial point. I don't publish anything without hitting on the reference notes and going to those reference items and reading them. If they're all from crazy people, I won't use it as a reference. I'll go somewhere else and continue looking. But it does a great job of providing you a skeleton to start with. Um, they would not be my end all be all. But if you're just looking for, like, who they're married to, which just happened with something Julie and I were working on offline, she had sent me a movie reference, and the the movie had something to do with the wife being, um, like a CIA person, and the movie was about a British prime minister, and of course, Tony Blair came up, and of course, thanks to Julie, Tony Blair's in the news today, and we had just looked up his wife. Well, son of a gun, his wife looks like a CIA person. And the movie that was made, what's the name of the movie? Can you post it there? Um, the Raven, do you have the movie handy? I was just like, so her and I yesterday are going back and forth about how this movie is basically based on the life of Tony Blair. And she's like, "Oh crap, I didn't look at Ghost Rider." There you go. She's like, "I didn't even look at the wife," and the wife turns out to be um, Intel. And so then today, Tony Blair comes up and he's going to go negotiate with Hamas. You're like, come on, he's a fascist. He's part of the whole Round Table establishment. So let me get this right. Israel is created as an extension of the Round Table, and you're going to have a Round Table guy come negotiate with Hamas, who is a terrorist stay behind unit that was funded by the same fascists. Your head's just going, I like that little emoji where the head blows up because that's what my head was doing this morning when I saw that Tony Blair thing. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. Yeah. So once you know, yeah, watch the wives. That's exactly right. Once you know the whole little circle, Tony Blair's part of it, Israel's part of it, Hamas is part of it. So why would they not send Tony Blair, right? Yeah. So anyway, we're going to close with that. But that's such a great example of the real wife. Yeah, right. So that's what I told her. I found out she's a graduate of the London School of Economics, which is part of the Fabian Society, which is part of the Round Table. Okay. So again, every piece of news that we are reading is relevant to everything we're learning. I just want to make that point. Y'all are not wasting your time here. It's all relevant. So go out and kick butt. That's all I got to say tonight. I'll publish the schedule in a little bit and get it out there for you. Love you guys. Thanks for being here.